Welcome back, everyone. Bentornati a Magazzino. My name is Vittorio Calabrese. I'm the director here, and I'm very excited about the first of 4 lectures this year. The lecture series on Arte Povera are at our 5th year. We started when Magazzino pretty much just opened, and I'm very excited for today, as we also have this beautiful sun surrounded by snow. Until last minute, we didn't know this was going to happen today. But I want to thank all of you for being here. I see some of our members. As you know, our Magazzino community is growing, and we launched our Amici di Magazzino, our friends of Magazzino, and your support and patronage helped us to do more and more programming of this kind and more. As you see in our parking lot, there's construction going on. I'm happy to be able to share with you that we'll be opening a new pavilion the 3rd week of September. So thank you. It's an exciting time. We're adding other 14,000 square feet of exhibition space. We'll have actually a cafe, a shop, and we'll be able to exhibit not only art, but also decorative arts more soon to be shared with you. So make sure you join our newsletters, and we'll be more programming also all summer with movies, concerts, really leading to the big opening right after Labor Day. I'm going to introduce our current scholar in residence for this year, Roberta Minnucci. Roberta is our Magazzino's 2022-23 scholar in residence, and she will address research topics which are strictly interconnected with Arte Povera's relationship with the past and its artistic exchanges with the United States. As you may know, each year we do invite a recent PhD graduate scholar focused on Italian art to spend an entire year here at Magazzino. Roberta is the last one, and she's been a resident of the Hudson Valley since last summer, and she's going to be with us throughout this year until the summer, actually. So the scholar works with us to actually work on curatorial programs, on research. They have their own research, and eventually to really build together this beautiful and interesting lecture series. I'm going to be a little bit more formal now on Roberta, and Dr. Roberta Minnucci is an art historian and curator specializing in Postwar Italian art. She obtained her PhD from the University of Nottingham with a thesis which examined Arte Povera's engagement with cultural memory. Prior to joining Magazzino Italian Art as the current scholar in residence, Roberta was a Rome Award holder at the British School at Rome, and the recipient of the first edition of the Researching and Rewriting Contemporary Art History Scholarship promoted by Fondazione Baruchello. Her research has been supported by the Getty Foundation, the Association of Art History, the Association for the Study of Modern Art Italy, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Her articles and essays have been published in peer-reviewed academic journals and exhibition catalogs. She has gained curatorial and research experience at different institutions, including Tate Modern, Historic Collection of Modern Italian Art, Christie's, Southampton City Art Gallery, Castello di Rivoli, and Museo Fondazione Pino Pascali. Thank you, Roberta, for being with us for this year, and I leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vittorio, for your kind introduction, and welcome. Everyone, it's a great joy to welcome you here for the first event of this year's lecture series entitled Arte Povera, Artistic Tradition and Transatlantic Dialogue. Curating the series has been a great pleasure, and first of all, I would like to thank all my colleagues here at Magazzino for their help and support. With special thanks to Laura Frencia, Carolina Czajnowska, Eve Aaron, and William McHenry. This year's lecture series will interrogate Arte Povera's artistic identity in close conversation with the works which are on display here at Magazzino. The 4 lectures will explore how, during the 1960s and 1970s, artists associated with Arte Povera reconsidered and redefined their practices by taking into account, on the one hand, the legacy of artistic tradition, and on the other hand, the dialogue with American art. The Italian artist's relationship with the United States was crucial within the artistic context of the time. References to Italian and European cultural heritage in Arte Povera appear to be employed to reclaim a specific artistic identity in the face of the increasing global relevance of American art. While Italy became a testing ground for experimental practices attracting international artists, the Italian ones traveled to and exhibited in the United States, where they found an important platform for presenting their works to a new audience. This led to an unprecedented artistic exchange between the 2 sides of the Atlantic, leading Italian and American artists to engage in a sustained dialogue that is still awaiting to be fully examined in the scholarly domain. By considering the Italian artists' relationship with their own cultural heritage, as well with the international artistic scene, the 4 lectures will explore the complex dynamics embedded in the progressive definition of an artistic identity for Arte Povera. I hope that you will join us for the next 3 lectures that will take place every other week in April, the 1st, the 15th, and the 30th. I will have the pleasure to deliver the next lecture on Arte Povera's reinterpretation of classical sculpture, followed by Dr. Laura Pettican, who will explore Arte Povera's relationship with the Baroque as a historical and conceptual category. Dr. Raffaele Vedarida will close the series with a presentation on the promotion and reception of Arte Povera in the US. The first lecture today will be presented by Dr. Marin R. Sullivan, who will investigate a number of sculptural projects created in Italy at the turn of the late 1960s and early 1970s by a number of artists, including Yayoi Kusama, Michelangelo Pistoletto, Robert Smithson, and Joseph Beuys, as a means to examine how the terms of sculpture were being transformed through transatlantic exchanges. The lecture will last about 45 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session. Dr. Marin R. Sullivan is a Chicago-based art historian, curator, consultant, educator, and writer with a PhD from the University of Michigan. She specializes in the histories of modern and contemporary sculpture, especially its interdisciplinary intermediate dialogue with photography, design, and the built environment. Sullivan is the director of the Harry Bertoia Catalog Raisonné and was the co-curator of Harry Bertoia Sculpture Mid-Century Modern Life, organized by the Nasher Sculpture Center. She is the author of Allies, American Sculpture and Architecture at Mid-Century, published by Princeton University Press in 2022, and Sculptural Materiality in the Age of Conceptualism, published by Routledge in 2017, as well as numerous catalog essays and articles. Sullivan currently serves on the board of Docomomo US Chicago and is a lecturer and guest curator at DePaul University. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Sullivan.
Thank you so much for that lovely intro, and to Roberta and everybody here at Magazzino for welcoming me. It's lovely to be here. Yeah. Okay. The Italian artist Giulio Paolini stated in 1969, quote, "It seems to me as though my works don't have a future, as though they are used up the moment they come into being, end quote. Made at the end of a decade that saw a radical worldwide transformation of vanguard artistic practice, Paolini's self-assessment expresses both an anxiety about art's permanence and an embrace of its inevitable impermanence. Just showing you here one of many examples I could have to illustrate that. A similar tension is also present in another post-war Italian work of art, Federico Fellini's 8.5 or Otto e Mezzo. In one scene, Daumier, the critic intellectual, tells Guido, the protagonist and meta-director, quote, "We are suffocated by words, by sounds and images that have no reason to exist, that emerge from the void and return to the void." And Guido asks him, besides, what's clear enough, valuable enough to deserve to survive? These are but two examples where such questions of creative existential crisis were raised during the 1960s throughout a rapidly expanding and shifting international art world. Artistic experimentation permeated across disciplines, mediums, and national boundaries. And while Paolini and Fellini were perhaps more concerned with the fixity of images, the issue of dematerialization and the rise of conceptualism also seemed to be eroding away at the inescapable materiality of sculpture. The long 1960s remains a somewhat nostalgic and at times overwrought topic, overwrought topic of art historical scholarship. But when seen through the lens of sculpture, two largely overlooked areas of inquiry emerge. First, post-war Italy offers an especially rich and revelatory context for examining changing conditions of vanguard art, and in particular sculpture. Second, photography, often dismissed as either a documentary supplement or offered as a substitute for the phenomenon it depicted, became crucial material components of a radical reformulation of sculpture during the period. In my book, Sculptural Materiality in the Age of Conceptualism, on which this talk today is based, I examined 4 exemplary projects created in Italy during the late post-war period. Yayoi Kusama's Narcissus Garden, Michelangelo Pistoletto's Sfera di Giornale, Robert Smithson's Asphalt Rundown, and Joseph Beuys's Arena, Where Would I Have Got If I Had Been Intelligent? Created by Italian and international artists in Italy, these projects introduced new materials, often embracing both the industrial and ephemeral, while also deploying new modes of staging and installation. Though diverse in form and intent, each presented sculpture as a highly orchestrated and collaborative event, with the artist acting as creative director and not just a hands-on fabricator. These 4 projects provide a way to explore how and why sculpture became something that remained firmly tethered to its status as material object, and yet was no longer bound to a singular permanent form. As Smithson understood, the most interesting vanguard art in the 1960s no longer operated in either 2 or 3 dimensions, but oscillated between, in, as he called it, a range of convergence. These projects suggest a new model for understanding sculpture, not as a single autonomous thing, but as a fleeting arena of engagement shaped by its place and circumstances in the physical world. None of these projects comprised a static or isolated object. They were constructed and existed in a complicated network of creation, patronage, and staging, aspects often disregarded in existing scholarship because, quite frankly, it's inherently messy. They were at the time, and have become since, dispersed things, and some exist only today in reconstructed form or through photographic and textual records. At the same time, it's important to realize that all of them were, from the outset, constituted in part through the extensive photographic material they generated. Photographs do not function here as mere documents or publicity stills. They connected the various experimental elements that came to constitute the work of art, from the coordinated processes of creation to the various installations and incarnations. While my chosen subtitle today might suggest talk explicitly focused on the intermedial relationship between sculpture and photography, I'm actually more concerned with how sculpture expanded its material boundaries while maintaining its medial ones. Photography was integral to this expansion, but functioned as a connective thread, weaving together the multiple materials, including the photographic image, film, performance, exhibition display, and the dynamic elements of everyday life, constituting the sculptural work. In integrating photographic components, sculpture became a node, an active, pulsing thing. The Italian art scene of the 1960s serves as an especially fertile context in which to examine how this relationship between photography and sculpture was cultivated and what was at stake in its development. Much of the existing scholarship treats Italian artistic output as isolated or regional, but it both shaped and was shaped by an international vanguard tendency exploring the radical possibilities of sculpture. Still coping with the legacies of fascism, the end of World War II, brought Italy drastic social, economic, and cultural change. American aid and the implementation of the Marshall Plan led to rapid industrialization and the rise of companies like Fiat and Olivetti, prompting the mass migration from the south to the north to meet labor needs. From 1958 to 1963, post-war Italy was shaped by the Miracolo Italiano, or the economic miracle, which brought modernization and Americanization to many aspects of Italian life. The desire for consumer goods and the importation of American popular culture affected more than just the Italian economy, immediately shifting the social and cultural landscape. Italian high culture in the post-war period was dominated by both the formation of a cultural elite and the anxieties of a seemingly contradictory encounter with consumerist mass culture. The 1960s in Italy saw an explosion of cultural output in film, the visual arts, literature, and criticism, creating a vibrant social and professional network among its practitioners. Umberto Eco's Opera Aperta, the open work from 1962, was especially influential across a wide range of artistic disciplines. For Eco, modern art was, quote, deliberately and systematically ambiguous, end quote. The world of art operated at the center of a field of possibilities, offering a plurality of possible readings. In short, the open work was a work in progress. Reverberating throughout much of the art in the 1970s in Italy was a utopian desire to break down conventions, allowing meaning to be fluid and explore ambiguity as artistic strategy. As Eco states, quote, "The 1960s were extraordinary, for we thought that a revolution of the languages of art could transform the world. And this conviction brought down the boundaries between the genres, between word and image and object," end quote. The Italian art world functioned as a major site of contest, an arena of both artistic reinvention and post-World War II nationalistic bravado that supported and generated a broad range of experimental, three-dimensional work. Italian institutions and galleries were particularly active in providing new kinds of exhibition spaces, creative freedoms, and financial support to both Italian and non-Italian artists. Group exhibitions and artistic events, including the Venice Biennale, along with a stream of foreign artists on modern-day grand tours, frequently brought together artists from the United States and Europe. Also present was a collaborative patronage model in which the person or group organizing the sculptural event played a central role in the creation of the work. That so many notable sculptural projects were produced in Italy during this time speaks not only to a fluid and international art scene, but one that was also increasingly affected by the specifics of place. One of the earliest, and I would argue most innovative, post-war international art events in Italy during the post-war period, for example, was Scultura nella Città. The exhibition took place during the summer of 1962 in Spoleto, a small hillside town about an hour northeast of Rome. Organized by the Italian curator Giovanni Carandente, Scultura nella Città was one of the first large international exhibitions of modern sculpture to take place outdoors in an urban environment. Carandente placed sculptures in the lived space of a city, in its streets and piazzas, but knew that for the exhibition to make a true impact, he would have to assemble some of the most notable sculptors of the day. Part of his goal was to give contemporary Italian sculptors the opportunity to present on a large world stage. But he was also aware of what the inclusion of figures like David Smith, Henry Moore, and Alexander Calder would do to raise the profile of the exhibition. Ultimately, he secured the participation of 53 sculptors who contributed a combined 102 works. And of course, of those 102 works, a very, very large portion was produced by David Smith, who probably proved more important than any other participant to the exhibition. After accepting Carandente's invitation to not only show in the exhibition, but to travel to Italy, Smith worked in an abandoned steelworks owned by the national steel conglomerate Italsider. In 1 month, he created over 20 sculptures, all named after the place of their creation. The massive quantity of the Voltri sculptures surprised the organizers, who had requested only 1, maybe 2 works from every artist. Such an American thing to do. In one of the most brilliant curatorial moves in the history of sculpture, yes, I will make that claim, Carandente decided to install 20 of the Voltri sculptures together in Spoleto's ancient Roman amphitheater. The presence of all of the works together in Spoleto's, in such an unusual and architecturally specific place, completely transformed the site. But the sculptures were in turn transformed by the space's unique characteristics and attributes. A Roman teatro, by its typology, is a site of transformation, a place of instability and action, an arena for the passage of time. While not necessarily an intention of their creator, the specifics of the site, the fact that the sculptures were positioned in the space like actors and viewers participating in some great performance, certainly brought a new dramatic element to the works. Because of their arrangement, a person viewing the sculptural group had no choice but to share in this performance, to become a fellow audience member on the steps of the ancient amphitheater. This was not a contemplative mode of viewing like that created while in a white cubed gallery, but one susceptible to and changed by the time of day, the weather, the elevation, the distance of the viewer, and all beautifully captured, collectively concretized by the photographs taken by Ugo Mulas. And we'll come back to Mulas in just a bit. In addition to events like Scultura nella Città, the Italian art scene in the 1960s regained greater international exposure through the Venice Biennale. Since its inauguration in 1895, the biennial has served as an important global stage for contemporary art and a site for cross-cultural artistic exchange. Both celebrated as a venue for experimental practices and accused of being nothing more than a backdrop for glamorous bourgeois commercialism, it always has been a magnet for criticism and controversy. The biennials of the 1960s proved especially effective barometers of the changing international art scene of the time and facilitated many important experimental artistic projects and presentations. In 1964, Robert Rauschenberg won the grand prize at the 32nd biennial, signaling for many the transfer of power in the art world to New York, much more complicated than that, and dominance of the American artists. The 34th biennial in 1968 erupted when unrest over the American cultural colonialism originating at the 1964 biennial collided with the student-led unrest occurring throughout Europe and the United States. In comparison, the 1966 Biennale was a relatively staid affair. While it may have lacked the large-scale international incidents and controversies of the preceding and following exhibitions, it is notable for showing a strain of experimental sculptural projects, and I would include Fontana's in that, that pushed against the established controlled space of painting. The biennial of 1966 proved a stage for artists to create unique, fleeting and charged environments that explored the intersections of sculpture, sight, and performance, including Kusama's Narcissus Garden. The work notably represented no country and was not installed in a national pavilion. Consisting of 1,500 mirrored factory-made plastic balls, the work was dispersed outside on a small lawn in one of the busiest areas of the Biennale, directly across from the massive Italian pavilion. Formally and conceptually experimental, Narcissus Garden was a sculpture that also incorporated many capricious elements, like the spectacle of the Biennale itself, the viewer, and the presence of the artist. In a large-scale international exhibition defined by hard nationalistic divisions, Narcissus Garden was an independent, if officially sanctioned, work that sought to move beyond established boundaries, both geographically and artistically. Narcissus Garden was comprised of multiple variable elements, more attentive to the creation of a total sculptural environment than a singular static object. One of the least critically analyzed work of Kusama's oeuvre, though now I would say probably one of her most popular and reconfigured in recent years, it also suffers from one of the most uniformly succinct interpretations, discussed as a kind of guerrilla-style proto-performance piece. And that has a lot to do with the fact that she did, for a very brief moment, sell each individual spears off for $2 a piece. The work's implications as a deliberately constructed sculptural environment that synthesized numerous strands of experimental art practices of the 1960s has been, unfortunately, overlooked and underappreciated on account of that. On a logistical level, and I love this photograph with Fontana on the right, kind of looking up at Kusama. On a logistical level, Narcissus Garden involved elaborate collaborative efforts and was made possible through Kusama's friendship with the Italian artist Lucio Fontana and Renato Cardazzo, who owned two very important galleries in Venice and Milan, respectively. These connections were a necessity for a work intricately entwined with within the context of one of the biggest international art events and dependent on a complex bureaucratic system of governmental officials, curators, critics, dealers, collectors. On a conceptual level, it wove together the presence of the object with the presence of the artist, creating an unstable, dynamic environment which integrated and relied on staged photographic elements. The work both responded to its location and was shaped by it. The circumstances of its creation, installation, and success were connected to and dependent on the institution of the Biennale. As one of the largest and most respected international art exhibitions, the Biennale gave Kusama access to an audience and exposure to critics and press that she never could have achieved on her own or in a different venue. The Biennale also offered her the ability to create dialogues with her contemporaries and position herself as an innovative, progressive artist. And I think this kind of self-positioning is something we'll come back to and is really, I think, a crucial element of what's going on here. The rise of gallerists like Cardazzo and the increased exposure of local avant-garde artists proved crucial to the growth and importance of the Italian art scene in the mid to late 1960s. By this time, the Miracolo Italiano had reached its apogee and Italy faced increasing unemployment and economic recession. The Vietnam conflict escalated and so did demonstrations against it. Labor protests and student revolts, as they did across Europe and the United States, coalesced around 1968, bringing the decade to an unstable and often violent end. Against this backdrop of revolution and counterculture, a very crucial network of artists, galleries, critics, and collectors established itself across Italy. This emergent network was strong enough that by 1967, there was support and promotion of its own avant-garde tendency, Arte Povera. Arguably more of a curatorial construct created by the critic Germano Celant than a bona fide movement, Arte Povera was comprised of a loosely connected group of young Italian artists predominantly working in 3 dimensions, who exhibited often together in thematic group shows at a small number of galleries in Naples, Rome, and Turin. Newly established and innovative, these galleries actively and enthusiastically supported experimental work in Italy, often collaborating on exhibitions and projects. For example, the three major galleries in Turin, Il Punto, Christianstein, and Galleria Sperone, concurrently held Contemplazione, the title being a play on words, translated as either contemplation or with time action. The show was characteristic of Arte Povera, exhibiting works that were sculptural in nature, investigated process, and sought to blur boundaries between art and life. As suggested by the title of the exhibition, there was also an interest in this idea of action, a word that would appear in countless exhibition titles, articles, protest posters over the next few years. As the curator Daniela Paolazzi wrote in the accompanying catalog, quote, "Art is another form of activity. It is a constitutional function of action. It is not the things themselves which are important, but that which is added to the things. The things are no longer for themselves. They are for what they produce, for the relationships they establish," end quote. One of the works featured in the exhibition, which is really funny to me that I'm just standing with Pistoletto behind me and this sphere to my right. One of the works, though, featured was Pistoletto's Palla di Giornale, sometimes known as Sfera di Giornale, or Scultura del Passaggio, so newspaper ball, newspaper sphere, walking sculpture, all of these various titles, which also I think is going to play an important part in our discussion. The most iconic photographs of this work in its initial iteration were actually film stills from Buongiorno Michelangelo, a film made by Ugo Nespolo, which shows Pistoletto and the artist Maria Poppi moving the large pressed paper orb through the streets of Turin. By their own objectness, their own form, these images present a complex material exchange between human action, sculpture, photography, and film that only multiplied and continue to multiply with each subsequent presentation, whether static or moving, of the spherical object. The ball of newspapers had originally emerged from a group of seemingly unconnected works known as the oggetti e meno, minus objects, that Pistoletto realized in 1966. More than simply a curious group, the minus objects were individual pieces that themselves quickly began to proliferate. Multiple versions, from the identical duplicates to the slightly altered, materialized in various configurations, sometimes with alternative titles, photographic images, films, and temporary displays like those captured in the film stills of the Scultura del Passaggio furthered an ever-expanding meshwork constituting what the sculpture is, folding into its form a nexus of objects and a plurality of single times. Photography, as well as film, became integral to the staging of the sculptural object as a means to convey the dynamic movement of the Scultura del Passaggio through both space and time. Works like newspaper balls and newspaper spheres, however, were not fait accompli, but sculpture energized, activated through its movement, through its encounter with the contemporary world as lived in real time. Action and interaction were becoming crucial concepts within this expanding network of vanguard artists and artworks and events in Italy during the 1960s. As Pistoletto declared in 1968, quote, "I am interested in the passage between objects more than in the objects themselves." And that's exactly what we've already heard Smithson talking about too, right? This kind of oscillation between dimensions, between actions, between objects. This tension between stillness and motion in Pistoletto's Sfere, between the simultaneous existence of so many iterations of sculptural objects and the sequences of their movement captured in photographic or filmic images, complicate the notion of what constitutes sculpture and its materiality. The contingency of the spheres resided in their interaction, in the external action enabled through the circulation of an object, whether through its own movement in the world, its dissemination through two-dimensional images, or its encounter with other things and agents. Pistoletto included a caged iteration of the sphere in one of the most important exhibitions to bring together so-called Arte Povera artists and other European artists working in a similar vein. Arte Povera più azione povera, Arte Povera plus action povera, held on between October 2nd and October 4th in 1968 in Amalfi, brought together the British artist Richard Long and two Dutch artists, Ger van Elk and Jan Dibbets, with other Arte Povera artists. The event, organized by the collector Marcello Ruma and curated by Celan, included an exhibition, a series of individual actions, a soccer game that worked as a group action between critics and artists, I wonder who won, performances, and a group discussion on the last day. Utopian again in its concept, it was seen by many as a short-lived realization of a desire to unite art and everyday life. The artworks were installed in public outdoor locations, including the former Arsenal, and artists went out into the town to implement their actions, as we see here with Richard Long, a very young Richard Long, often involving other public participants. While the development of Arte Povera was concentrated in Italy, clear artistic parallels emerged across Europe and the United States in the 1960s. Like Arte Povera, this tendency was variously, and I would say very insufficiently, labeled post-minimalism, conceptual art, conceptualism, anti-form, right? All of these different labels emerge and try to kind of capture what's really a very nebulous, diverse body of artists and artworks. And all of them, I think what does unite this kind of diverse range of practices was this move away from traditional modes of art making. They turned instead to very unconventional materials, new types of installation tactics, and of course, different types of exhibition spaces. From New York to London to Dusseldorf to Turin and Rome, group exhibitions brought together artists of various nationalities with the express desire to have them create work on site, right, that responded to the site and shared a similar experimental approach. These group exhibitions were imbued with the spirit of action and the work produced was predominantly sculptural, hybrid, and extremely ephemeral. And again, when I say like this is messy, I mean like literally it was messy. These artists kind of coming into these spaces and creating a mess, as we see here from When Attitudes Become Form. Italy in particular proved a supportive locale for this type of artwork. For example, Richard Serra's first solo exhibition was held at the Galleria La Salita in 1966 and sparked controversy when he showed a selection of deliberately incendiary sculptures that use live and stuffed animals in cages as its material. In yet another example of collaborative patronage, the Roman gallery owner Fabio Sargentini asked Robert Smithson, who had first exhibited in Rome in 1961, to come and create a piece for his Gallery Latico in December of 1969. The result was not only a little discussed gallery installation, so there was a kind of non-site, to use Smithson's language, at the gallery in Rome, but the real kind of star of the show was this action, Smithson's first ever large-scale outdoor work, and the first of his what are known as pours, for obvious reasons, Asphalt Rundown. Sargentini enabled Smithson to create the work, funding the project and the artist's visit, finding the site in the abandoned quarry outside of Rome, and procuring machinery and materials, right? So Smithson's doing none of this. It's the gallery owner that's doing all of it, obviously by the directions of the artist. But there's a lot of gray area there, right? The work was a monumental undertaking, literally monumental in scale, with the artist directing the dumping of several tons of hot asphalt down the hillside. But it was also largely inaccessible. It was seen by only a few people in person at the time of the dumping or since, and it was also incredibly finite. The asphalt transformed through the pouring, but it would undergo increasingly destructive changes over the next 40 years, eventually disappearing completely at the hands of erosion and commercial development. Many have interpreted asphalt rundown as something of an outdoor action painting, monumentalizing the drip into a slow, if finite, ooze. Smithson, like many artists of the 1960s, was both influenced by figures like Jackson Pollock and also wanted to kind of push against every innovation of the previous generation. The artist Alan Capro summed up this generational tension perfectly when he said, quote, "It was a tremendous relief to become attuned to the world around me and to participate directly in it, really as an action artist and not merely metaphorically as one. Once that became possible for me, I saw a way out of the canvas, out of the gallery, out of the stage," end quote. All of these projects broke through the rectangular frame and pedestal, a characteristic unifying much of the experimental sculptural work of the decade. These sculptures changed and gave shape to its surrounding space, presenting a new complex and often paradoxical idea of sculpture as something more than a singular autonomous object, as something that expanded outward into the shared space of the viewer. These artists created environments which remain focused and centered on the creation of three-dimensional objects while taking account of the variables of surrounding space. The environmental became a collision of sculpture and performance, a constantly shifting configuration of three-dimensional objects and fleeting interventions staged by the artist. With the ephemeral nature of these projects' materials and installations, it perhaps comes as no surprise that photography becomes a key component of the work. Though rarely discussed with regard to these projects, artists generated and disseminated countless and countless and countless photographs. They began to pay increasing attention to how their work was shown, often photographing it themselves, or more the case, seeking out specific photographers. Cross-cultural dialogues and international exchanges in Italy were not limited to exhibition venues or innovative patrons, but also included a community of Italian photographers who became the most notable and in-demand art photographers of the period, including Ugo Mulas, Gianfranco Gorgoni, and Claudio Abate. Artists of all nationalities working in the burgeoning avant-garde tendencies consistently turned to these photographers to not only document their work, but to capture its spirit. Photography became an important and mandatory element of exhibition practices within Italy's gallery system of the 1960s. Abate, who was the official house photographer for Sargentini's Galleria Lattico, was instructed to be present before, during, and after installation of everything that went into the gallery. The photographer inevitably became very close with the artists he worked with, including Arte Povera artists like Pino Pascali, who we see here, and Yannis Kounelis, who frequently showed at Lattico. Abate consistently created some of the most iconic images of their works, photographs like those showing Pascali and Kounelis playfully engaging with their sculptures. For example, Abate captured Kounelis's bringing in 12 large and very alive horses into Lattico on January 14th, 1969. Present for the installation of 12 cavalli, 12 horses, Abate photographed 10 of the 12 horses tied to the three walls of the gallery space, dramatically framing what was a nebulous and dynamic work into an easily consumable picture. The photograph is symmetrical, with the horses balanced on the right and left sides of the composition. The ceiling beams run through the middle of the image, bringing further balance, but also compressing the space with a theatrical flourish. Two rows of reflecting lights on the floor lead our eyes to the blank rear wall, where two dark horses are centered, creating a distinguishable vanishing point. Abate was also present on the morning that Smithson dumped asphalt down the side of the quarry and created a similarly dramatic, perfectly framed image of asphalt rundown. Abate, though, did note to me that at the time he really didn't get the work, and he kind of recalled very whimsically that Sargentini had to like literally drag him out by the ears of his bed in the morning, kind of like plying him with multiple cups of espresso, and he just didn't want to go, and he didn't understand anything. But so even though he's kind of literally dragged up out of his bed, his image of asphalt rundown, like his photographs of Dodici Cavalli, have become the image of the work, right? Like this is the image when you Google this work, this is what comes up, right? Still to this day. And Smithson did take his own photographs, so it's not like this is the only photograph that was taken. There are other examples out there, just not as iconic. In Abate's photograph, the flowing black asphalt is shown bleeding through the crevices and folds of the earth, frozen in a moment of transformation, immediately after it was dumped from the fully extended truck, but just before it reached the end of its surge at the base of the quarry. In photographic terms, the black mass at the center of this image pierces the composition, ironically playing with the notion of a vanishing point. Aesthetically successful, these two photographs often are taken again as the perfect document of the work each represent. Sargentini quickly distributed them to the press and published them in his gallery publications. Pretty much in every publication on Arte Povera or land art, earth art, these are the images of the works that are reproduced. Photography, of course, serves here as an invaluable tool, right? We can't look at these works anymore. I can't go to the quarry and see this piece. So they are invaluable for accessing works that are no longer accessible. They can transport us back and allow us to evaluate at leisure daring and experimental environments that have since been dispersed and disconnected. As is the case with most of this type of work, however, the photograph is inevitably only a partial description. It captures the location and the essential elements of the work, but not really its nature or its purpose. It captures, the photograph, no matter how good, can never be more than a memory of something lost, of something ungraspable. A photograph cannot communicate the crushing noise of a dump truck and tons of asphalt hitting the earth, or the smell of horse excrement that slowly built up in the gallery. It does not express the anxiety that one must have felt standing in a room with horses that could have bucked at any moment, nor does it communicate the comedy and lightheartedness of these works, right? Kind of framed, we take them to be so serious, these documents, but these were not in a lot of ways. A photograph cannot convey the process of the sun altering the patina of Kusama's silver orbs, or the elements affecting any of these outdoor works, whether in a quarry, a park, or an ancient amphitheater. Often, photography can only prompt the viewer to reconstruct this unphotographable phenomenon, to imagine what it might have been like. With their active nature, often unstable materials and multiple materializations, these works both demanded and complicated a relationship with photography. Take, for example, a work by the Italian artist Giovanni Anselmo, his Untitled from 1968. Today, when it's presented, it materially consists of two granite blocks, one tied to the other by a thin copper wire, separated only by a piece of lettuce. But what actually constitutes this work? What is Untitled from 1968 by Giovanni Anselmo? The first time it was exhibited at the artist studio in Turin, it was shown with a piece of meat instead of lettuce, and a pile of sawdust that began to catch any liquid dripping from the meat. Numerous photographs taken from 1969 to the present show the work in a variety of other configurations. When it was exhibited at the Galleria Sperone in 1969, the lettuce had replaced the meat. And by the early 1980s, it was shown without the sawdust altogether. Or take an even more complex and inherently photographic project, Joseph Beuys's Arena. The work is an amalgamation, but unlike Anselmo's Untitled, it is a collection of parts that have remained unchanged since the piece was first exhibited in 1972 at Lucio Emilio's Modern Art Agency in Naples. At its most base level, Arena consists of one oil can, 2 small, uneven stacks made from 21 slabs of wax mixed with fat and 4 plates of copper and iron, and 100 gray aluminum frames, each measuring approximately 55 by 32 inches, sealed with heavy exposed metal bolts and thick hand-blown sheets of glass. 1 frame contains a solid piece of yellow glass, and 2 others blue. The title of the piece references the single frame that contains only a mass-produced postcard depicting the ancient Roman amphitheater or arena in Verona, Italy. Encased within the other 96 frames are 264 black and white photographs, all of which depict previous works by Beuys, arranged without any clear organization, all on gray mats. Beuys did not personally shoot any of the photographs, but he did, in some cases, treat the surface of these photographs with sulfur, acid, wax, and his trademark matte brown paint, Bronnkreuz. The photographs, more than any other individual or collective element, are the most distinguishing feature of Arena. And as such, they have monopolized the discussion of the work within art historical analyses. Because of what they depict and reference, their critical extrication from the whole of the work has led to the now dominant reading of the piece as a kind of visual autobiography, or CV, while the other components serve as little more than an elaborate display platform. However, when examined not just in the context of what they depict, but also how they are constructed as images of artworks and employed as sculptural elements, the photographs generate a complex dialogue between presence and absence, materiality and immateriality, image and object. Arena is not just a multi-part sculpture of metal, fat, and chemically treated paper, nor just photographic archive documenting Beuys' actions. It simultaneously functions as a collection of photographic images, of sculpture, and a sculpture made from photographs. Like the other sculptural projects I have discussed, Arena not only calls our attention to how integral photography is to our understanding of the work, but also exposes photography's contradictory limitations, making us realize that a photograph is a secret of a secret, and that more they tell us, the less we know. The various incarnations of Arena over the past 40 years suggest a work defined by this fleeting and flexible interconnectivity of its multiple parts. And I'll just say here that we're looking at installation shots by Fabio Donati showing the work installed in Rome the following year, so shown in a completely different configuration. Today, the work is owned by Dia, and it's oftentimes shown either in stacks or during Beuys' retrospective, kind of in this long kind of strip row, right? So the actual configuration, the material kind of form of the work has also changed. And this is also the case, of course, with something like Kusama's Narcissus Garden that now is kind of constantly being reconstituted and reconfigured and shown indoors and outdoors and in all sorts of different ways. And I think in some ways there's little new in this in terms of how this applies in sculptural practice, right? If anything, this has become even more entrenched within the contemporary art world. But something is lost or altered in the process and needs to be accounted for in historical analyses of this work. And this was something that was already on Pasquale's mind in 1967 when he stated, quote, "Once your things are taken by the gallerists and you arrange them in a gallery, they become something else. They become perhaps in a negative but inevitable way a kind of cemetery in which these things are really tombs," end quote. And I think what becomes so extraordinary about the photographs that are staged in conjunction with these works is the ways in which the artist's own person, their own body, their own performance of the work becomes so intimately connected to, right? So it's not just, I'm going to create this work, I'm going to show it in the gallery, but we have with multiple versions of the projects that I've talked about today and others that we could point to, Joseph Beuys kind of surprising Amelio by going like, I'm going to do a performance, and he ends up sitting and rubbing the copper for 4 hours while people just kind of walk around him, right? He does this when it's shown in Rome at Latico, and in a couple months after it's first shown, he performs anarchist klutz and kind of walks around the gallery performing with this work, right? And it calls into question, is this part of Arena? Is this something different? Is Arena acting as a stage set here? And how did these photographs then become part of the overall history, the overall kind of material meshwork of what we think about when we think about Arena? This was, of course, also the case with Kusama and Narcissus Garden. And in fact, there's very few photographs of the piece that are actually the sign that I showed you at the beginning is one of the only ones from the opening weekend that I've been able to find that doesn't have her in it, right? So it's a conscious decision on her part to link herself with her work, right? It's a kind of strategy that we start to see artists employing in this way. And I think, of course, with a piece like Narcissus Garden, this becomes really materially connected to the fact that these spheres are reflective, right? So the idea of narcissism here and reflectivity and having the viewer kind of look at themselves while looking at the work also becomes a kind of crucial material element to those projects. So we see just kind of, again, and she's in different outfits, she's in different configurations, but very staged, very conscious. And I don't want it to seem like that's a negative thing. I think it's actually a strategy that's very normalized today, but she was certainly a pioneer of. Just a detail here. So we have examples again of artists with the works that I've discussed. And I'm going to wrap it up so I'm running out of time. Translation is perhaps one way to think about the relationship between photography and sculpture. As Moulas stated, to photograph a sculpture means to see the sculpture. It means giving it space, a spotlight, and a point of view. To photograph a sculpture is like translating a piece of literature from one language to another. You have to use another language in order to complete the interpretation. Like the process of translation, these photographic translations keep the work alive in our own present moment. Through their photographic components, these works are both forever present and irretrievably lost in an unrepeatable configuration or installation. In choosing the possibilities of open work, sculpture no longer strove to be finished, but reconstituted over and over and over again. And photography was there to capture each temporary manifestation. If we choose not to diminish the photographs as mere publicity shots, we are confronted with the formulation of sculpture as something beyond its objecthood and yet inextricably bound to it. These sculptures may still exist in some physical form, on view in museums, locked up in private collections, or separated from the rest of their group. They have been and will continue to be recreated. But while they are reconfigurable, they are also determinately unrepeatable. The subsequent reiterations are but continuations in an ever-expanding constitution of the work. They can never truly replace or reproduce. The resulting photographs of these projects not only present multiple views of the same sculpture, which after all is not a new phenomenon, but create a tension between the physical three-dimensional form and a haunting two-dimensional image. The hybrid status of the works I have discussed, existing as both material phenomenon and photographic image, suggests an alternative way in which the work of art has been rethought through the medium of sculpture. These projects in the Italian art scene of the 1960s as a whole speak not to a dematerialization of the art object, but to a multiplicity of materializations, which allow us to see and experience art as something used up the moment it came into being. Fellini's Daumier may not agree that such work should have survived or come into being at all. But like Guido, human nature makes us perhaps unable to let go of that which is lost, or that which populated the past, captured in a series of real, fleeting interactions that we can never again truly access. What we are left with, and must learn to give full account to, are the remnants, the traces of what once was. And this, after all, is Fellini's point. After listening to Daumier's monologue, Guido gets out of his car and walks over to the ruined sets of his film and to a circus ring on the beach. His tattered fragment past manifested through the presence of the people who have populated his life, merrily creating circles around him. These living remnants, like the brief sculptural interventions in the Italian art scene in the 1960s, and their incomplete photographic traces linger, refusing to dematerialize. Thank you so much.